Professor Gary Nash of UCLA is the author and defender of the standards.
They don't think our kids should understand some of the darker episodes of our history. I don't think we'll maintain a democracy and the values we believe in if we don't learn from the past and our kids don't learn the lessons from history.
In the history books that many of us read in school, women like Betsy Ross and men of color like George Washington Carver and Sitting Bull were the exceptions that prove the rule. American history was the story of great white men.
You're indicting the history that I was taught. You were probably taught.
Yes. It was a history, as I learned, where slaves happily picked cotton and lived in snug cabins with plenty to eat, because after all, they'd been rescued from African savagery. And as for women, when I grew up learning history, they were notable only for their absence. I don't think we can go back.
Nobody thinks we should go back. But Cheney, who now works at a conservative think tank, says in this new version of American history, a lot of great white men have disappeared.
If we were not to have Martin Luther King mentioned in these standards from grades 5 to 12, I would be outraged, you would be outraged, most Americans would be outraged. Similarly, I think we should be very troubled that other great heroes from our past have disappeared.
Who's missing?
The scientists. Alexander Graham Bell isn't in here, Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison. It's very curious. I think it's partly because they were all white men.
It's a question of emphasis. Harriet Tubman, who helped Southern blacks escape slavery, mentioned 6 times. But Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union Army against the South, only once. And Confederate hero Robert E. Lee, not at all. But some white men are prominently represented. The Ku Klux Klan and Senator Joseph McCarthy, almost 20 times each.
One communist teacher out of 100 can do untold damage.
What is the relative contribution of George Washington and Joe McCarthy? Is Joe McCarthy 6 or 7 times as important as George Washington in our history?
Mrs. Cheney will say you are obsessed with McCarthyism. 17 references.
She counted up the word McCarthy in several classroom activities where the name is repeated by way of saying, study McCarthyism, and what McCarthy stood for, and what were the voices of those who opposed McCarthy. You see, we're up to 3 already.
George Washington is never mentioned, Mrs. Cheney says, as in the context of being first president of the United States in your standards. This does not make sense. Can it be true?
Because the standards don't mention names. They mention the creation of the presidency.
How should children be taught about George Washington? What should they be taught?
They should understand how Washington emerged out of the planter aristocracy of Virginia. And they should understand it was a slave-owning aristocracy.
Was he a great man?
He certainly was a great man.
You mentioned slave-owning first.
Well, he was a great man, no doubt of it.
But do we need to weave America's sad and long history of racism and slavery throughout the entire timeline of American history?
Yes, we do, because it happened.